The name he wore. James Voss had spent 6 years learning to speak Threnic before he ever set foot on Ashkar Prime, and none of those 6 years had prepared him for the particular silence that fell over the council chamber when the second speaker rose to reject the treaty. "Your Earth Assembly asks us to open the deep vaults," the second speaker said, his four-jointed hands folding with the precise, unhurried menace of something that had never once needed to hurry. "You call this an exchange of resources. We call it theft wearing a diplomat's coat. It's not theft if it's offered freely," James said. He kept his voice level. 6 years of training had taught him that too. The moment your voice shakes, the negotiation is already lost. Earth isn't asking for the vaults. We're asking for trade rights to the outer strata. There's a difference, and I think you know that. "I know that your Earth Assembly sent one man to speak for an entire species," the second speaker said. "That tells me everything about how much you value the outcome." James had come alone by design, a gesture of trust, his handlers had called it, back on Earth, in a briefing room 40 light years and what now felt like several lifetimes away. Standing here in a chamber built from black volcanic stone with alien eyes weighing him from every tier, alone, didn't feel like trust. It felt like exposure. "I was sent alone," James said, "because my government believed one honest voice was worth more than a delegation of hedged ones." James tried 3 more times to salvage it. Smaller concessions, a postponement to reopen talks once cooler heads prevailed, even a formal apology to carry back to Earth. None of it moved the chamber. He'd understand only much later in the dark, with far too much time to think about it, that the outcome had never been about the vaults at all, that the second speaker had wanted an example from his very first sentence, and every offer James made afterward was just rope for a noose already tied. The second speaker rose, and the chamber rose with him, and the ruling came down flat and absolute. Espionage under the guise of diplomacy, sentence of death, to be carried out in the palace's lower yard within the week. "Take him to the dungeons," the second speaker said, "to wait for it." The guards had James by both arms before he finished processing that the word execution had actually just been spoken aloud about him, in a language he'd spent 6 years learning to speak well enough to die in. The dungeons beneath the Ashkar Palace were older than the palace itself, carved, not built, into rock that had never seen a sun. James was thrown into a cell with 11 others, most of them barely conscious, all of them wearing the same rough grey sample tags around their necks, a Threnic execution custom, he'd learn later, meant to track which prisoner belonged to which crime, so the right person died for the right offense. The man in the corner was already dying. James could see that clearly, even in the near dark. The shallow, irregular breathing, the grey pallor under skin that had once maybe looked something like James's own. "A trader," one of the other prisoners murmured, "caught smuggling something across a border he shouldn't have crossed. 3 days from natural death, regardless of what the Ashkar did to him." James spent those 3 days doing the only thing he had left to do, listening. He listened to guards talk amongst themselves, half in boredom, half in the particular cruelty of men who'd stopped seeing prisoners as anything but a schedule to keep. He learned the tag system wasn't cross-checked with faces, only names, spoken by a warden too senior to bother looking closely at who wore what. He learned the rotation had a 6-minute gap between torch checks, right after the second watch changed. He learned all of this not because he had a plan yet, but because 6 years of diplomatic training had taught him that information was the only currency that never ran out, even in a cell. The plan itself came to him on the second night, watching the dying trader's chest rise and fall in that same shallow, failing rhythm, and it arrived with a kind of terrible clarity he wasn't proud of and couldn't unthink once it had. He didn't decide to do what he did next, so much as watch himself doing it, the way you watch your own hands move in a dream. He traded tags with the dying man during that 6-minute gap on the third night. "Why?" the dying man rasped in broken Threnic when he understood what James was doing. "Why would you?" "Because you're going to die either way," James said quietly, fitting the tag around the man's neck, taking the man's onto his own. "And because I have a brother back home who needs to believe I tried to come back to him. That's not a lie, if it's still true when they execute the wrong name." The man didn't have the strength to argue. James wasn't sure afterward whether what passed over the dying man's face was gratitude or simple confusion at being spared the indignity of dying as a nobody one last time, dying instead wearing the name of an alien diplomat the whole planet would remember. 3 days later, the guards came for James Voss. They took the dying man, and James, wearing a stranger's name, a stranger's tag, a stranger's fate folded into his own, watched from the shadows of the cell as they led him away. He didn't watch the execution. He didn't need to. He heard the crowds roar through 3 floors of stone, and he understood, with a clarity that felt like drowning, that somewhere across the void, his brother was about to receive the worst message of his life, and there was no way, none, to reach across 40 light years and tell him it wasn't true. What James hadn't planned for, in the 3 days he'd had to plan anything at all, was what came after. A dead man's name didn't get him released. It got him forgotten, filed away as a nameless prisoner in a system that no longer had a reason to track him, since the one entry that mattered had already been marked closed. Guards stopped calling his cell by any designation at all. Meals came less often. He was moved, twice, deeper into the undercroft, to make room for prisoners whose cases still had paperwork attached to them. He survived the first year on scraps, and on the same stubborn instinct that had gotten him through 6 years of language drills and treaty language. Find the pattern, and the pattern will eventually give you an opening. He mapped the undercroft in his head, cell by cell, guard rotation by guard rotation, the way he'd once mapped Threnic verb conjugations, because it was the only thing that kept the dark from closing all the way over him. In the second year, he found a gap in a drainage channel that ran beneath the lowest tier, barely wide enough for a starved man to fit through, which by then he was. He didn't run. Running, he'd decided, was how you got caught by something with a name and a face on record. Instead, he went sideways, into the maze of disused tunnels beneath the palace that no one had walked in generations, and he became, in the truest sense, no one at all. A rumor the undercity guards occasionally traded over drinks, a ghost blamed for missing rations, a shape seen once, at the edge of a torch's reach, and never confirmed again. He lived that way for 4 years. He ate what he could take without being seen. He learned the tunnels better than the men who were paid to guard them. And every single day, in the parts of his mind he couldn't starve into silence, he thought about his brother, and hoped, with a kind of desperate, illogical faith he'd never admit to anyone, that somehow, impossibly, John had not been told, or had not believed it, or had found some way to keep living anyway. He had no way of knowing that 4 light years away, in a garage in Ohio, John had believed it completely, and it had broken something in him that would never quite set the same way twice. John Voss was rebuilding a carburetor in his garage in Ohio when the 2 officers came up his driveway, and some animal part of his brain knew before either of them said a word, knew from the way they walked, slow and heavy, like men carrying something they didn't want to set down. He wiped his hands on a rag that used to be white and stepped out to meet them, and some smaller, stupider part of him kept hoping, right up until the older one reached up and took off his cap, that this was about a parking ticket, a wrong address, anything at all besides what it turned out to be. Mr. Voss? The cap came off. That was the detail that would stay with John forever after. Not the words, not even the man's face, just the cap coming off, slow and formal, like some kind of ritual the assembly trained its officers to perform. Your brother's mission suffered a diplomatic incident on Ashkar Prime. I'm very sorry to tell you. John didn't hear the rest of it as words. He heard it as a sound, a low roaring that started in his ears and didn't stop for 3 days. Somewhere underneath the roaring, a memory surfaced without being asked for. James on the phone 2 weeks earlier, packing sounds in the background, saying, "I'll call you the second I land, don't wait up," in the same easy voice he'd used 100 times before, because there had been no reason that day for either of them to think it might be the last time he said it. James was the careful one. James was the one who read every line of every contract, who called their mother every Sunday without fail, who'd sat by John's hospital bed for 11 straight hours after the accident that took their father and nearly took John too, holding his hand through 2 surgeries, and never once leaving to sleep or eat or do anything but be there when John opened his eyes. James was supposed to be the one who came home safe, because James was too careful, too smart, too good to die on some rock 40 light years from anyone who loved him. That was the deal, as far as John had always understood it. Unspoken, but absolute. James kept everyone else standing. Nothing was supposed to be able to knock James down. John stood in his garage for a long time after the officers left, carburetor still in pieces on the workbench, the rag still balled in one fist, and felt something in himself go very quiet and very cold, like a house with the power cut. He didn't cry, not that night. He sharpened tools instead, methodically, one at a time, laying them out in a row like he was preparing for a job because his hands needed something to do, or they were going to start shaking and not stop. Somewhere in the 3rd hour of it, he realized he wasn't grieving anymore. He was planning. The first year, He told himself it was research. He read everything the assembly would release about the incident, which wasn't much, and everything it wouldn't, which he found other ways to get. He learned Threnic from a black market language tape. A discharged logistics officer sold him for $400 and a promise not to ask where it came from. Running the drills alone in his kitchen at 2 in the morning with a bottle of whiskey he never let himself finish, because finishing it would have meant stopping, and stopping meant sitting still with what had happened, and he would not sit still with it. The second year, research became preparation. He sold the house first. Too many rooms that still smelled like his brother's visits. Too many mornings, waking up in it alone. Then the truck their father had left him. Then every tool in the garage that wasn't strictly necessary for the one purpose they now all served, which was funding a route off-world that didn't run through any assembly checkpoint, that would ask why a civilian wanted passage to a planet still under interdiction. He found a black market broker who dealt in forged clearances, paid him in 3 installments, and spent the money he had left on something no broker could sell him: training. A former Marine 2 towns over, retired and bitter and drinking himself toward the same kind of quiet John recognized in his own reflections some mornings, agreed to run him through 6 months of close-quarters drills in exchange for cash and no questions asked. John showed up every single day. He broke 2 knuckles in the first month and didn't miss a session. By the end of the 6th month, the Marine stopped correcting his form and started just nodding, which from that man was as close to a eulogy for the old John as anyone was ever going to get. The 3rd year, he trained with blades, because a gun would flag every checkpoint between Earth and the outer transit stations, and because there was something about a blade that felt more honest for what he intended to do with it. He learned to move through a room the way water moves through a cracked pipe, finding every gap, never stopping long enough to be caught in one place. He learned to kill quietly, which was a different skill entirely from killing at all, and a much uglier one to actually practice. Their mother died that year. Pneumonia, quick, almost merciful in how little time it gave anyone to dread it. John sat with her the last week, and never once told her what he'd become or what he was building toward, because some part of him still wanted her to die, believing her surviving son was going to be all right. He told himself, standing over her grave beside the empty plot they'd kept for James, a headstone with no body under it, a date of death with a question mark quietly implied, that she was the last soft thing he owed anyone. After this, there'd be nothing left in him to spend on gentleness. The 4th year, he left. The broker's forged clearances got him as far as a transit station on the edge of Ashkar space, where he switched to a black market freighter crewed by men who didn't ask why a human wanted quiet passage to a planet still nominally hostile to his entire species. He paid them the last of his money and did not look back at the ship once it broke atmosphere, and Earth's blue curve fell away behind him for what he assumed, privately, would be the last time. He didn't expect to come back. He'd stopped, somewhere in the 3rd year, planning past the moment he'd reached the man who gave the order. Everything after that was fog he didn't need to see through yet. The Ashkar capital hadn't changed in 4 years. The black volcanic spires still clawed at a sky the wrong color. The same eyes still watched from windows set too high to be anything but deliberate. John walked through the outer markets in a merchant's coat, a blade in each boot, and let the roar in his ears guide him toward the palace, the way it had guided him for 4 straight years. He spent his first 2 days in the capital simply watching, old habits from the Marines' training, and from 4 years of telling himself patience was a weapon too. He learned the guard rotations. He learned which gate took deliveries at dawn, half-staffed and inattentive. He learned the layout of the lower levels from a drunk former palace guard he bought 3 rounds for in a market tavern. A man who talked more than he should have about a ghost the Undercroft guard still muttered about, a prisoner or a rumor of one that had slipped their custody years back and never been found. John filed that detail away without understanding yet why it made something in his chest go still and quiet, the way a held breath goes still. He went in through the dawn gate on the 3rd day. The first guard, who recognized his forged papers as false, died without ever raising an alarm. So did the second. By the time anyone realized something was moving through the palace's lower levels, something quiet and precise and utterly without mercy, John had already put down 11 men and was 3 floors closer to the throne room than any assassin in Ashkar history had ever gotten unnoticed. He didn't kill everyone in his path out of bloodlust, though it would have looked that way to anyone watching. He killed with the same cold efficiency he'd spent 4 years building, sparing anyone who dropped a weapon and ran, because his war wasn't with soldiers doing a job. It was with a chain of command that ended in exactly 1 chair, and every man between him and that chair was simply distance to be closed. "Where is he?" John said to the 12th guard, the one he let live just long enough to answer, the one who gave the execution order, the second speaker. "Where?" The guard, choking, pointed toward the throne chamber's inner doors. John left him alive. It wasn't mercy, it was efficiency. A corpse in the wrong hallway might raise an alarm 5 minutes sooner than he wanted. The second speaker was mid-council, mid-sentence, mid-some other treaty with some other unlucky species when the chamber doors blew inward off their hinges. "You," the second speaker said, recognizing the shape of a human, even through 4 years and a face gone hard as the volcanic stone around them, "should not be able to be here. You executed my brother," John said. His voice didn't shake. 4 years of practice had burned that out of him completely. "James Voss, diplomat, one man sent alone because his government trusted your people enough to send someone unarmed. An unfortunate necessity of law," the second speaker said, rising, 4 jointed hands spreading in something that might have been meant as placation. "The treaty rejection required—" "I don't care about your treaty." John was already crossing the chamber floor, guards moving to intercept and falling one after another like something out of a nightmare the Ashkar hadn't known to have yet. "I care that you took the only family I had left and turned him into a headline back home. I care that I buried an empty box because there wasn't enough of him left to send back." The second speaker's guards, 6 of them, elite, the best the throne room kept close, moved as one. John moved faster. It wasn't skill alone anymore. It was 4 years of grief compressed into muscle memory, every motion rehearsed 1,000 times in a windowless room with nothing but whiskey and a photograph of his brother for company. When it was done, John stood alone before the second speaker, breathing hard, blade in hand, the alien backed against the black stone wall with nowhere left to retreat. "Please," the second speaker said. The first time, John would think later, that word had probably ever left that mouth. "The order came from the king. I only carried it out. Killing me changes nothing." "No," John agreed, "but it's a start." The king's audience hall was the largest chamber in the palace, built to make visitors feel small beneath its vaulted stone ceiling. And for 4 years, the king had never once doubted his own safety within it. He doubted it now, watching a single blood-soaked human stride through doors that 8 of his personal guard should have been standing behind. "You executed my brother," John said, before the king could speak, before the guards could finish drawing. His voice didn't shake. 4 years of practice had burned that out of him completely. "James Voss, diplomat, one man sent alone because his government trusted your people enough to send someone unarmed. An unfortunate necessity of law," the king said, rising from the throne, guards fanning out on either side of him. The second speaker's ruling was sound. "Your brother was found guilty of—" "I don't care what he was found guilty of." John was already crossing the floor. "I care that you took the only family I had left and turned him into a headline back home. I care that I buried an empty box because there wasn't enough of him left to send back. I care that I sat with my mother while she died and never told her the truth because I couldn't tell her that without telling her the rest of it too." 8 guards. John didn't remember all of them afterward, only pieces, the way a fight always came back to him later. The give of a wrist under his blade, the particular sound armor makes when it isn't fast enough. Someone's shout cut short before it finished. When it was over, he was standing at the foot of the throne with blood on him that wasn't his, and the king had nowhere left to retreat to but the throne itself. "Please," the king said, "killing me will not bring him back." "I know." John's voice, for the first time in 4 years, cracked clean through the middle. "I've known that since the second I got on the ship. I stopped caring somewhere around year 2. He killed the king the way he'd killed everyone else between himself and this room. Quick, without cruelty, because cruelty took a kind of feeling John didn't have room for anymore. And then it was done, and the roaring that had driven him for 4 straight years, through the training, the blades, his mother's funeral, 40 light years of black, simply stopped. He stood in the sudden silence of it, in a throne room gone still with fear, and understood, with a clarity worse than the roaring had ever been, that he had nothing left to do. He had built 4 years of his life around a single door, and he had just walked through it, and there was nothing on the other side. James was still dead. He would always still be dead. Nothing John had just done moved that fact 1 inch. He might have stood there until the guards found their courage and came for him, except for what surfaced, unbidden, in the quiet. The drunk palace guard in the market tavern, 3 rounds of something bitter, talking too freely about a ghost the Undercroft guards still muttered about, a prisoner who'd slipped away into the dark and never come back into the light. John hadn't understood at the time why that detail had lodged itself in his chest like a splinter. He understood it now. Somewhere beneath this palace, there were people exactly like the man his brother must have become in his last days alive, nameless, forgotten, filed away, and left to rot because the paperwork on them had run out. John couldn't give James back so much as a single hour, but he could stop this palace from making another one. It wasn't mercy, exactly. He didn't have much of that left in him either. It was the last scrap of something he used to be, surfacing one final time before whatever came next. "Every cell in the undercroft," he said to the guard captain frozen by the doors, his voice flat and final. "Open them, all of them, now, or you're next." Word went down through the palace in the strange, stumbling way orders travel when everyone giving them is terrified of the man who gave the first one. Guard captains relaying it to junior officers, who relayed it to key wardens who hadn't touched half these locks in a decade, some of them fumbling with mechanisms they'd only ever seen used one direction. John didn't wait for it to finish traveling. He took the dead king's signet off a hand already going cold, in case any guard downstairs needed proof the order was real, and went into the undercroft himself, torch in hand, not looking for anything, not hoping for anything, just finishing the only thing he had left to finish. The lower levels hadn't seen daylight in centuries, and they didn't get it now, only torchlight and the groan of ancient locks giving way one by one as John moved down the row himself, not trusting anyone else to do it right, not trusting anyone else at all anymore. Prisoners stumbled out of cells, blinking, disoriented, some of them weeping, some of them too far gone to understand they were free. John didn't stop to explain himself to any of them. There was nothing to explain. He wasn't a liberator. He was just a man with a key and 4 years of debts he'd never pay off with anything as small as this, doing the only thing left within his reach. Cell after cell came up empty of anything he recognized. Strangers, some Threnic, some other species entirely, all of them flinching from the torchlight like it might be one more cruelty invented just for them. Twice John knelt by a body that had stopped moving long before he arrived and made himself check anyway, made himself be sure before moving on with something in his throat he refused to name. Each cell he unlocked was, in some small way, the cell he hadn't been able to unlock 4 years ago. He didn't examine that thought too closely. He didn't have to. It was there anyway, in every turn of every key. He almost walked past the last cell at the end of the last row, the one nobody had bothered to lock as carefully, because nobody had expected its occupant to last much longer anyway. The shape huddled in the corner didn't stir at the torchlight the way the others had, didn't flinch, didn't blink, barely seemed to be breathing at all, and for one terrible second John thought he'd found another body he'd have to kneel beside and confirm as gone. Then the shape moved, just a hand, first, fingers curling weakly against the stone, the way a man moves when moving costs him something he doesn't have much of left. John crouched anyway out of the same stubborn habit that had made him check every still shape in every cell before this one, and lifted the torch and looked. It took him a full 3 seconds to understand what he was looking at. 3 seconds of his mind simply refusing the information his eyes were sending it because the face in front of him was too thin, too grey, too much like something scraped down to its last layer to be a face he knew. And then it was, all at once, the way a picture resolves out of static, and John's whole body went as still and cold as it had 4 years ago in a garage in Ohio. Except this time the roaring didn't come. This time there was nothing but a silence so total he could hear his own heartbeat slamming against it. "James," he said, and the name came out broken, unrecognizable even to himself, like a word in a language he'd forgotten he knew. The eyes, sunken, glassy, struggling to hold focus in the torchlight, found him slowly, and something moved behind them that hadn't been there a second before. "John." It cost him something to say it. John could see the effort travel visibly across what was left of his brother's face. You're not supposed to be here." "Neither are you." John's voice broke completely. 4 years of grief and rage, and now something else entirely. Something too large and too sudden to have a name yet. Finding nowhere left to go but out. "You're supposed to be dead. I buried you. I buried an empty box with your name on it, and I stood there and I let them lower it into the ground." "I know." James's hand found John's arm, weak, barely more than a tremor. "I'm sorry, I couldn't get word to you. I didn't even know if anyone was still looking." "I wasn't looking." The words came out of John before he could stop them, raw and true all at once. "I want you to know that. I wasn't down here looking for you. I thought you were gone. I've thought you were gone for 4 years. I came down here to let strangers out of cells because I couldn't stand the thought of one more person rotting in the dark the way I told myself you had. And I didn't let myself hope, not once, because hoping was the thing that would have finished me off completely if it turned out to be wrong." He stopped, throat working, and pulled his brother in against him, careful, terrified at how little there was left to hold, how light he'd become. "And you were here the whole time. You were right here." "I know," James said again, and this time it might have been an apology or a kind of wonder, or both at once. "Guess we were both looking for something, just not each other." John gathered him up, careful, terrified at how little there was left to hold, and carried him out past rows of empty cells and freed prisoners, still stumbling toward whatever daylight they could find. Out past a throne room that no longer had a king in it. Out past 4 years, he would spend the rest of his life trying to understand, and never fully would. Outside, for the first time in 4 years, Ashkar's wrong-colored sky looked, to John, almost like something worth living under. "Stay with me," he said, brother in his arms, voice raw. "Just stay. That's all I'm asking now." James's eyes fluttered shut, but his hand tightened, faint but real, around John's wrist. "Always was the careful one," James murmured. "Guess it's your turn to carry me for a while."